Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome to Lost in Adaptation. This is a web show about comparing films to the books that inspired them to see what parts remain true to the original plot and themes and which parts diverged and why. This episode's subject is The Village of the Damned, a 1960 film adaptation of the 1957 science fiction horror novel The Midwich Cuckoos by British author John Wyndham. Wyndham is also known for The Day of the Triffids, another novel in the genre about mobile carnivorous plants chomping their way through most of humanity. This book has seen a fair few film, TV and radio adaptations over the years, as recently as 2009. Though they were successful in their time, it seems that neither The Midwich Cuckoos or Village of the Damned survived the test of time quite as well. But that is no problem. Your Uncle Dom is always happy to summarize a classic for your viewing convenience. During an otherwise unexceptional day in the 1950s, without any warning or explanation, a small rural British town called Midwich is enveloped in a massive, invisible dome that renders everyone within, and anyone who tries to enter it, instantly unconscious. The inhabitants awaken a day later to find that every female inhabitant of childbearing age is now pregnant. The government obviously takes a big interest in this, but for the most part they're allowed to carry on with their lives as best they can with these unexpected expectancies. All the children are born looking pretty much identical, with very fair hair and golden eyes that almost seem luminescent. Right from infancy they display seemingly impossible powers of control over those around them, able to influence people into compulsive obedience using just their minds. Any parents who attempt to relocate out of the town are forced to come back so the children can stay together, and anyone who accidentally hurts one of them is driven to self-harm in retribution. This escalates when they get older and start responding with lethal force to any perceived threat or attack. After they force a young man to kill himself, it sparks an escalating blood feud with the rest of the town that results in many more deaths. The narrator of the book is a resident of the town called Richard, though it's presented sort of like a memoir of the events, so it often switches to third-person accounts that he wasn't present for but collected later. I consider him an odd choice for narrator because of all the characters in the book, he's probably the least involved in the plot, as he and his wife were out of town on the fateful day of impregnation, so avoided that fate. Then, after a year or two, he moves and spends 8 years in Canada, only returning to Midwich by chance, right before the climax of the children's story. By far the most integral character to the plot is an acquaintance of his, Gordon Zellaby. Zellaby. This is just a personal suspicion, not something I can lay out as fact, but I got the distinct impression that Zellaby was one of those idealized author insert characters. Wyndham and Zellaby are around the same age, they both married or remarried quite late in life, and they're both authors. Zellaby is extremely successful and rich, he has a younger wife, and he's presented as having a flawless grasp of science, politics, psychology, and history. Heck, he's even compared to Alexander the Great in the final chapter. And people are super aware of his awesomeness too. Everyone from the doctor, the vicar, the police to the government keep him abreast of goings on and go to him for advice regarding every big decision made in the story. I've noticed there's a particular type of white middle-aged man who believes that the most important part of any story is not the big events themselves, but what white middle-aged men have to say about those events. So the result is all the action takes place between the chapters, and the majority of the book is some grey-haired guy recounting them to other people and waxing philosophical for page after page. It kind of reminded me of the works of Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park and the Andromeda Strain, as his books also had great concepts but focused way too much on the ramblings of self-assured men to be particularly exciting. Anyway, getting back to the plot, as things escalate between the alien kids and the rest of the town, Major Westcott, the military agent in charge of monitoring the sitch, confesses to Zellaby that Midwich was not the only town in the world that got knocked out and knocked up. Most importantly, there was a town in Russia that seemed to be having an almost identical experience, except the children had seemed to be advancing to adulthood even faster than the locals, who already looked and acted several years older than they were. Something had just happened there to make the Russians nuke their little town off the face of the earth, and send an emergency message to the rest of the world begging them to do the same. The Midwich kids start taking drastic steps to protect themselves, stopping anyone from being able to leave the town and crashing any planes that try to fly overhead. And they explain to Major Westcott that their domination over the rest of humanity is inevitable, as the inherent indecisiveness of Western democracy will save them from the same fate as their Russian cousins, and they intend to use their mind control to force the military to take them somewhere safe where they can grow to full power unhindered. Things do seem to be pretty hopeless, but of course, all-round badass Gordon Zellaby decides to take matters into his own hands. He has a small amount of goodwill with the children, as he's always treated them with respect, often bought them sweets, and used his personal projector to play interesting movies for them once a week, which seemed to entertain them despite their inhuman nature. His solution to this threat to humanity is pretty simple. He hides a bomb in his movie equipment and blows himself and all of the children to Kingdom Come. The end. No, really, that's the end of the book. So all in all, I think the concept of this book is nothing short of genius, and I think Wyndham is an excellent writer, but his choice of execution is definitely not my cup of tea. Another issue is you can super tell this was written in the 1950s. Yep, it's casually racist grandpa time again. Yay. One of the other towns that got the Midwich treatment was a settlement of, Eskimos on Victoria Island who murdered all the babies as soon as they were born because they looked different, and that's just how savages do. I also felt increasingly uncomfortable every time he referred to the children as a minority group when describing the threat that they represent to people's way of life. In a posthumously published biography, it's revealed that due to a rather unpleasant and traumatic childhood that involved a highly neglectful mother, Wyndham was left with very, complicated feelings towards women, believing there were a select few who were strong, admirable people, but the vast majority were brainwashed slaves, intent on the singular desire to be wives in baby factories and utterly incapable of taking care of themselves or anyone else because of it. This is very much reflected in his writing. Some of the Midwich victims are portrayed as being ecstatic and grateful that they have been given this chance at motherhood, despite it being the result of a violation. The fact that one of the mothers is a very young teen girl is rationalized because the characters think that 90% of women would love to go straight into motherhood as soon as they are biologically capable. This is something that is considered to be an unfortunate yet nevertheless undeniable statistic by the wise and progressive Zellaby. One would assume that this goes without saying, but just in case, it is absolutely fine to have a preference for strong independent women, and good to acknowledge that there are societal pressures placed on them to assume a subservient role in life sometimes, but that doesn't make it okay to spout such vitriol towards women who fail to conform to the ideal that you feel they should aspire to. Believe it or not, Wyndham's sexism was actually called out by critics in his time. Like, damn dude, you gotta be really blatant to be roasted in the 1960s. Anyway, like I said, I don't consider this to be an objectively bad book. I super respect it as a work of fiction, but I do consider it to be, to quote ContraPoints,
problematic.
Oh, and in case your ornithology trivia isn't up to scratch, the book's title is a reference to the evolutionary survival tactic of cuckoos to lay their eggs in other birds' nests, so the burden of protecting and rearing their young falls to other species. Birds can be real assholes. As you can see, the title of the film was changed for marketing purposes. The studio felt the original might fail to convey that it was a horror movie to the casual cinema goer. This evidently paid off, as the film was a smash hit with audiences lining up around the block to see it. It's the most well-known work of the director, Wolf Riller, but the screenwriter, Sterling Siliphant, has quite a few hits under his belt, including The Heart of Night, Towering Inferno, and The Poseidon Adventure. Fun trivia, he was also very good friends with Bruce Lee. The film stars classical actor George Sanders, classic B-movie actor Michael Gwynne, and film and television star Barbara Shelley, who tragically died very recently of COVID-19 complications. May she rest in peace. Originally, the film was an American production and presumably would have been set there. However, the US studio stalled and eventually backed out altogether due to pressure from a group burdened with excessive Catholicism, who strongly felt that the fact that virgin births featured in the story meant that it was an attack on their religion. One can only assume they were worried that the hidden message was that Jesus was also a space alien parasite. The film was transferred to a UK production company, and the setting changed accordingly. Riller was brought on a mere 6 weeks before production began, and insisted on some serious rewrites to the script, feeling that Siliphant had failed to grasp how British life differed from American. This is delightfully ironic considering the book was British in the first place. I'm most amused by the idea of the script being Americanized, then painstakingly de-Americanized again. Considering the film was shot over just 6 weeks with a budget of $82,000, 2000, I'm legitimately impressed with how solid the finished piece is. The editing in particular is really well done and builds the mood and tone effectively. The pacing in the first half at least is pretty seamless. They utilize still frames and split screens in order to make the special effects in any way affordable, and while they of course don't hold up these days, they're definitely not to be scoffed at for the innovation and creativity they represent. I have no complaints about the adult cast, many of them veterans of Hammer films, so very at home in horror productions. The child actors cast to play the aliens are also pretty good, all things considered. They were genuinely menacing in some scenes as they shot their inhuman and malevolent glares at people. Finally, this isn't really a big deal, but why did they make the kid on the poster so derpy looking? I mean, look at this poor sod. The kids look so much better in the actual film. Why would they do this to him? Right, I dare say it's past time we talked adaptation. By the way, if you've not encountered this story in any of its forms, but this is still sounding a little familiar, it's probably because a parody of the film featured in The Simpsons episode, Wild Barts Can't Be Broken. The Simpsons Did It is becoming a surprisingly semi-regular theme for me. The basic structure of the story is largely intact and, quite pleasingly, the original tone of dread and horror is translated to screen almost perfectly for once. Specific plot accuracies also include everyone in a set radius around the town of Midwich getting the sci-fi chloroform treatment, various police and military units being unable to enter without falling victim to and losing a reconnaissance aircraft in the process, the field then vanishing of its own accord as silently as it appeared, the discovery of the pregnancies at first eliciting a range of positive to negative reactions from the people depending on their circumstance, then taking on a universal feeling of dread after they realize it's clearly too widespread to be natural. Much like the book, there's unfortunately more focus on how the situation affects the menfolk than the women, who are, actually the ones going through the trauma of being used as incubators against their will. The filmmakers went all out on the children's hair and eyes to convey the eerie, inhuman look of the kids, even in black and white. The revelation that other towns around the world had experienced these same baby boomers Midwich, and alas, the plot point that all of the non-white people involved had committed mass infanticide immediately. The children eventually all leaving their parents to stay in a government-run boarding school in town, to most people's relief, and the sudden end to that relief when they start responding to every incident and threat with murder, and the escalating violence all around as a result. The wise and powerful Zellaby is there in almost all of his glory, seeing the writing on the wall faster than anyone else, discovering their ability to know what any other member of the group has learned, even if they don't physically meet through observation, and the application of a puzzle box experiment, and building a rapport with the children in order to try to bridge the gap between them and the rest of humanity. After they become the last of their kind, the Midwich children attempt to demand transportation to a new location where they would be free to do whatever they want, and Zellaby's combustive answer to the question of what to do with them. I'm summarizing quite heavily here, but it really is pretty close to the book in general. Certainly enough that I think those involved had a healthy respect for the work they were adapting.
Gee golly gosh gloroski, thought Gordon Zellaby as he stepped onto the bridge of the Enterprise. Here I am, the youngest lieutenant in the fleet, only 50.5 years old. Captain Kirk came up to him. "Oh, Lieutenant, I love you madly. Will you come to bed with me?" "Captain, I am not that sort of man." "You're right, and I respect you for it. Here, and take over the ship for a minute while I go and get some coffee for us." Mr. Spock came onto the bridge.
What are you doing in the command seat, Lieutenant?
"The captain told me to."
Flawlessly logical. I admire your mind. Thankfully, several of my issues with the book were addressed and corrected for in the film. Most significantly, they shifted the focus away from Zellaby pontificating endlessly about events post hoc. Instead, they let you see the action as it occurs, which allows for much more tension in the story. In my opinion, this made a huge difference to how consumable the plot is. Unfortunately, while the film does tone down the contempt for women in general, it manages to find its own way of being sexist. Zellaby's wife, one of the strong-willed women that Wyndham actually approved of, is regulated to a fairly blank character with little to no agency in the story. Like many others, this production had to deal with the strict, though sometimes inconsistent and often nonsensical censorship at the time, forcing a fair share of changes onto the story. The body count is toned down considerably. The day they spent unconscious alone caused at least a dozen fatalities, as 2 families burned to death in a fire, and several people who were unlucky enough to be outside died of exposure. The scary wee nippers scrambling among man's mind with pure terror and panic. By far, one of the most graphically harrowing descriptions in the book is toned down to them just putting him in a very temporary stupefaction. You can also tell the producers were still a little wary of the pushback they'd gotten over the virgin birth element, dancing around the idea by implying it heavily without actually saying it in as many words. Fear of angering the censors is also partly responsible for the absence of a UFO in the film, the other presumably being budget. Originally, the aliens came to Earth in big round spaceships, which were seen parked in the center of the Nickel zones, though they were gone before anyone could decide what to do about them. No one was quite sure how the aliens impregnated the townsfolk. Most people speculated some sort of high-tech implantation. However, there even being the smallest chance that it could be interpreted as the aliens sexually assaulting them while they were unconscious was cause for them to decide not to risk it. So in the film, the aliens themselves were never on Earth, and the theory is they implanted their young using some sort of interstellar energy beam. Speaking of budget, the limit of it resulted in a vastly reduced cast. There are only a dozen children in total now, as opposed to the 60 or so of the book, and they wrote out a ton of other government officials, police chiefs, and military bigwigs who floated in and out of the story. Several of the remaining characters are combined into a single unit. For example, Major Bernard Westcott and Dellaby's son-in-law Alan Hughes are rolled up into one guy called Alan Bernard. I think this is the first time I've seen an adaptation actually combine the names of two characters as well as their role in the story. The children no longer look almost exactly alike, an obvious impracticality in casting. Their rapid aging is also less extreme now, as they looked 16 at age 8 when they were exploded. As mentioned, the adaptation retains the children's ability to know what another of their group has learned, but in the book, this only applied to kids of the same gender. Zellaby was convinced that this meant that there were only really two aliens that just happened to have 30 separate bodies each. He dubbed them Adam and Eve, giving them the ominous overtones of being only the first of a whole new and soon-to-be multiplying race. Another significant change was the addition of an extra power. The extraterrestrial Kitty Winkles are now not just able to influence people, they can also read people's minds, giving them the ability to foresee threats to themselves and be more certain that the humans of the village would never accept them. This leads to Zellaby having to find a way to block them from doing this as he waited for his bomb timer to tick down. His solution was to concentrate his whole mind on picturing a brick wall, which actually works as the kids have to force the mental image to break down before they can see his plan, and by then it's too late. This imbues the climax of the story with way more tension than the book, which, as I've mentioned in detail, wasn't really interested in anything that happened in the moment, only the aftermath. Additionally, the fact that he was clearly under assault in his final moments provides some small offset to the fact that, all justifications aside, at the end of the day, our hero is suicide bombing a room full of children. And there's a significant morality shift like this across the whole story to make things more black and white than they were before, humanizing the humans and removing a lot of the nuance from the actions of these space babies. This may sound weird, but the alien murder children are not exactly evil in the book. It's more a case that they are an extremely dangerous mix of inhuman, powerful, and, as hard as it is to remember because of their abilities and unusual behavior, also part genuine children. None of what I'm about to say is intended as a justification for murder, but it's worth noting that the little blondies never attacked anyone unprovoked. It was always after someone attacked them, attempted to be aggressive with them, or accidentally hurt one of them quite badly. When any children are hurt, they sometimes lash out with all their strength in panicked self-defense or retribution, partly because they don't know their own strength, and partly because they haven't had a chance to develop any empathy yet.
Kids are pretty fucked up anyway. They're awful people. They're tiny, tiny little Hitlers.
The Midwich children's full strength is enough to allow them to effortlessly kill, so, at least with the first few deaths, there's a case to be made that it was an unmalicious knee-jerk reaction of a juvenile. Now, the film kept their reactions as is, but they consistently toned down the extent of the danger or hurt that sparked them, making them seem way more overtly evil as a result. For example, a car accident that clipped a child and left them severely injured now barely touches her, but they still force the poor man to drive straight into a wall wall. In revenge, a relative shot one of them, again grievously wounding him before the others compel him to use his other barrel on himself. Zellaby the Magnificent talked him out of his vengeance in the film, and he's in the process of walking away, but the children still make him blow his own head off when they see in his mind that he even considered it. Good lord, they even contemplate murder for the sin of throwing a football at them. Even when they're not using deadly force, they still respond with needless sadism. Mrs. Zellaby's space son forces her to boil her own hand in a pot simply because she served his milk too hot. Meanwhile, the townfolk are shown as much nicer people, exacerbating their victimhood at the hands of their youthful interlopers. I'm not gonna lie, a lot of them were straight up judgmental arseholes originally. At one point early on, an abusive father punched one of the kids, and I can't say I was super sad to hear they made him beat the crap out of himself. They also play up the surrogate parents maintaining maternal affection for the children, even once their inhumanity starts to show. Something that originally went right out of the window once the kids were old enough for it to be apparent just how different they were in behavior as well as looks. However, this is not to say that the children were not as great a threat in written form. In fact, ironically, the stakes were much higher in the book. It all hinges on the fact that the children were pretty honest about the fact that they intended to dominate mankind. It wasn't due to a lust for power, they just considered it inevitable once they were well established, because their capabilities allowed them complete control and their sense of self-preservation was so powerful. Book Zellaby genuinely harbored some affection for the children, but saw their destruction as a sad necessity to save humanity. In the film, no such lofty claims were made by the Xenobabes. They simply got tired of people at their current location constantly trying to interfere with them and telling them to stop making people burn themselves alive. Zellaby's sacrifice is more motivated by emotions now. Having championed the children earlier in the film and talked the government into letting them keep their freedom of movement while he tried to teach them morals, he felt personally responsible for all the innocent people they had subsequently killed and wanted to stop them from hurting anyone else in the future. You're shielding your mind from us, Mr. Zellaby. You're thinking about a woman you see on the weekends? Mistress Raven?
Oh, well, you'll see about that.
She wears so much leather. And what's that in her hand?
Don't look at that, it's not for you.
Why were you crawling around on all fours and barking, Mr. Zellaby?
Oh, thank God.
Not a particularly bountiful section here, though what does feature suggests that the filmmakers saw some of the same issues with the book as I did. Richard, the book's superfluous narrator, is jettisoned from the story completely, allowing for Zellaby to be treated as the official focus instead of just the de facto one. How little his absence affects the plot, I think, proves how Richard really was just in the book to be someone that Zellaby bounces ideas off occasionally. Because his moving to Canada and then returning for a visit 8 years later was such an awkward and cumbersome way of introducing a time skip, this film, which just moved forward a few years without any big fuss, became one of the rare examples of a film handling the structure of a multi-year story better than a book. Zellaby's daughter also got the boot, and again, the plot doesn't really suffer for it. In fact, I think it allowed for a little more space to develop the remaining cast, playing up how happy the Zellabys were when they thought they were having a regular child, and the heartbreak they felt when it turned out to be, not that. Whether due to budget or time, they left out the section of the book where several women attempted to move away from the town, but were all simultaneously forced to come back in the first big display of their children's powers of control. Some of Zellaby's more out there musings on the universe are quietly dropped. His personal theory that all the different races of the world are probably different alien species that were planted on Earth at some point or another to see which would rise to power over the others, for one. Big yikes. Also shit, wasn't that a South Park episode? In a note that he left to his wife, Book Zellaby revealed that he only had weeks to live anyway, having contracted some sort of long-term illness. I don't believe that this was intended to imply that he wouldn't have done what he did otherwise, but he clearly hoped it would make his widow less resentful towards him. The final omission I want to mention is the moment just before Zellaby kills all the aliens. As they arrive at the school with the film equipment, Richard is shocked to see the interstellar cuckoos actually acting like children for the first time. So pleased to see Zellaby, the one human who still treated them with any kindness, and so excited to watch the movie he had brought with him. This is the only time you directly witness something like this in the story, and It's not by accident that it takes place right before Zellaby kills them all. Final thoughts. All in all, I think the film does recreate the story at its core reasonably faithfully, even if there were a few changes made or forced on it. Some of these changes proved to be beneficial to the story, others not so much, leaving pros and cons to both versions. In principle, I would say the story is superior in the book due to its nuanced discussions of the subjects of morality and self-preservation, but as I mentioned at length at the start, in my opinion the format is such as to make it virtually impossible to really appreciate. Despite stripping away said nuance in favour of the safe yet less thought-provoking simplicity of a good versus evil struggle, the film is leagues ahead in being genuinely entertaining. I can't in good conscience commit to saying that one is better than the other, though that's not really supposed to be the point of this show anyway, so if either sounds appealing to you, have at it. In related trivia, Wyndham apparently started a sequel, tentatively titled Midwich Main, but didn't like how it was turning out, so abandoned it after just a few chapters. The film did end up getting a sequel in 1964 called Children of the Damned, but it was mostly a rehash of the first film and in general not very good. John Carpenter attempted a remake in 1995, but it's also not very good. It's just the story again, but set in America with way more graphic violence. It's really only memorable for starring Mark Hamill as a gun-toting reverend and Christopher Reeves as the renamed modernized Zellaby character. I mean, yeah, you might as well cast Superman to play him. Before we part ways, if I could be so brazen as to request you assist in reinforcing my channel's shields against the uncaring ravages of the YouTube algorithm by powering it up with likes, comments, and posts on these social medias, I would be indebted to you. If this is your first Lost in Adaptation viewing experience, do consider subscribing and please make yourselves at home. My beautiful watchers are a much kinder, positive, and welcoming community than I probably deserve. I very much won the YouTube lottery there. If your hunger for content cannot be satisfied by what's available on YouTube, there's a few Patreon exclusives you might enjoy, along with access to my Discord server and the chance to take part in those polls you see at the start of episodes. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Please take care of yourselves out there in these troubled times, and I hope you tune in next time.
I don't think that I'm that child's father. Maybe this is all some kind of communist plot. Do you think there's something in the water? Either way, don't ask for any child support. I don't think that I'm that child's father, honey. Now, if you did the deed with a spaceman from the third moon of Jupiter, that's your business. But don't try to make it mine. We both know what that German shrapnel did to my downstairs mix-up.
Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, Shelby Holtz, Satel Spurtloff, and Kat Harker. Shout out to Ilnej for performing this awesome tune, check out his channel for more parody and original songs, and a huge thank you to this video's co-producer, Kate Robinson. She does some really amazing work on her channel that I think you would really enjoy, so be sure to check that out too. I love you, buddy, but you just for like a few more hours you can't sit on this cushion. Matt, whatever. Don't correct me, Sir Terry. Sir Terry. Sir Terry, come on. Don't be a butt. Sir Terry, if you start eating that piece of paper... Oof, you little bugger.